The Second Coming of Christ. I am fully aware that millions of sincere and devout Christians are looking forward to an event that they describe as the Second Coming of Christ. There are many different theories and beliefs about the Second Coming and what it might be like. However, most of them describe an event in which I will appear physically and remove all darkness and imperfections from this planet. I will appear as the King, and I will bring God's kingdom to earth. I am Jesus Christ, and I must tell you the truth about this matter. I very much desire to see the second coming of Christ as a physical reality of this planet. I very much desire to see my Father's kingdom manifest on earth. However, I must tell you frankly that the event envisioned by most Christians simply will not come to pass. Allow me to explain why. Let us begin by considering the historical fact that shortly before the year 1000 AD, many Christians believed that the second coming of Christ was imminent. Let us begin by considering the historical fact that shortly before the year 1000 AD, many Christians believed that the second coming of Christ was imminent. People believed that I would appear physically and roll up the world as a scroll. It is an undeniable fact that these expectations were not fulfilled. Likewise, shortly before the year 2000, many Christians expected the second coming of Christ as the inauguration of the new millennium. This did not come to pass. Based on these observations, I hope you will accept the simple fact that I will not suddenly appear and remove all darkness from this world. There are two good reasons why this event will not come to pass. The outer reason is the law of free will. I have already told you that humankind has created the current conditions on planet Earth. Therefore, these conditions are the sole responsibility of humankind. People must learn that they are responsible for their use and misuse of God's energy. Therefore, God will not simply take away from them that which they have created in violation of His laws. God has provided a way out so that people can uncreate the darkness they have created in ignorance. However, people must do so consciously and willingly. Planet Earth is a schoolroom for life streams. If God or I suddenly removed all imperfections created by human beings, how could people possibly learn the lesson of life? When you accept the law of free will, it should not be difficult to see that the second coming of Christ, as envisioned by many Christians, would prevent people from learning the lesson of life. I am Jesus Christ. I am a spiritual teacher. I want to see people learn the lesson of life. I will go far in my attempts to help people learn that lesson. However, I will not take away people's opportunity to learn the lesson. The true second coming. Let me now explain the inner reason why the second coming of Christ will not be envisioned by many Christians. I have already told you that it is the deepest desire of both God and myself to see you and all other human beings walk the path of personal Christhood and eventually put on the fullness of that Christhood. God wants all of His sons and daughters to come home and join the wedding feast in His kingdom. However, you can come home only by putting on the wedding garment of personal Christhood. My beloved brother of light, Gautama Buddha, gave a very profound teaching that relates to this topic. The essence of Buddhism is that human beings have fallen into a lower state of consciousness dominated by Maya, or illusion. Because of this illusion, people cannot see the fundamental reality that everything is the Buddha nature. Therefore, people have built a false sense of identity as mortal beings, and they cannot see themselves as the Buddha incarnate. The essence of Buddhism is that all life streams must strive to reach a state of consciousness called enlightenment. When you've reached enlightenment, you realize that everything is the Buddha nature. Therefore, you see and accept that you are already the Buddha. Many followers of Buddhism subscribe to the belief that the goal of Buddhism is to become the Buddha. This belief is both correct and incorrect at the same time. A human being cannot suddenly shift from a state of consciousness that is dominated by illusion into a state of consciousness of full enlightenment. Therefore, all spiritual teachings on this planet talk about a path. If you are a follower of Buddhism, you are walking a path towards enlightenment. However, you are not walking a path whereby you are becoming the Buddha. The very concept of becoming something implies a distance between you and what you are becoming. The very essence of Buddhism is that everything already is the Buddha nature. Therefore, you are not in the process of becoming the Buddha. You are in the process of coming to the realization that you already are the Buddha. This is not simply a play on words. It is essential that you realize the difference between being and becoming. Overcoming separation. How do you come to the realization that you already are the Buddha? You must overcome the sense that you are separated from the Buddha, that you are not yet the Buddha. As long as you think that you have to become the Buddha, as long as you think that you have to become something you are not, there is a sense of separation and distance between you and Buddhahood. As long as there is this sense of separation or distance, you are not the Buddha. The consciousness of Buddhahood is a state of consciousness that is higher than the consciousness of Christhood. Yet in this context, I desire you to realize that what I have said about Buddhahood equally applies to Christhood. When I talk to you about the path of personal Christhood, I want you to realize that this is indeed a gradual path whereby you raise your level of consciousness to a higher level. This path cannot be traversed in one giant leap. You must travel this path by taking many small steps. Yet the end goal of the path is that you accept your true identity as a Christed being. In other words, the goal of the path is not that you become the Christ. The goal of the path is that you come to the realization that you already are the Christ and that you were never separated from your Father in heaven. That sense of separation was simply an illusion. It was Maya. The practical implications of this is that as long as you identify the Christ as being someone or something outside yourself, you cannot fully merge with that Christ. For me as a spiritual teacher, this fact presents an interesting dilemma. I am the spiritual teacher who was appointed by God to descend to this planet and demonstrate the path of personal Christhood. I could demonstrate that path only by walking the path and thereby putting on my personal Christhood. When you put on that personal Christhood, you literally overcome all sense of separation between your sense of self and the universal Christ mind. You are an individualization of that Christ mind. You are the Christ in embodiment. That is why I make many statements that begin with the words, I am. I am sure you recall some of these statements. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And I and my Father are one. Can you now see my dilemma? In order to demonstrate the path of personal Christhood, I must be the Christ. I must become one with the universal Christ mind. When I achieve that oneness, everything I do and say reflects that oneness. Therefore, my statements reflect the fact that I am the Christ. Yet when people hear another person say, I am the Christ, the relativity of the death consciousness automatically makes these people believe that the person is something in which they are not. In a sense, as long as a person is dominated by the death consciousness, that person obviously is not the Christ in embodiment. That person has the potential to be the Christ in embodiment. In other words, the very act whereby I demonstrated Christhood can, if misunderstood, prevent people from personally attaining that Christhood. I came to show people the open door that no human can shut, namely the door of personal Christhood. If people do not understand my true teachings, then I become an idol that prevents people from walking through the door that I walk through. I hope you realize that this is the last thing I want to see happen. A new sense of identity. How do you become the Christ in embodiment? By overcoming all sense of separation or distance between you, your sense of identity, and the universal Christ mind. The problem is that as long as you think that someone outside of you is the Christ, especially if you think that person is the only Christ, then you probably cannot fully accept that you are the Christ. To accept your personal Christhood, you simply cannot identify the Christ as being something or someone outside or apart from you. In unity, there can be no separation or distance. The point I'm making here is that if I appeared on earth in some sort of physical manifestation, that appearance would actually make it more difficult for people to put on their personal Christhood. You might remember that I warned people about false appearances related to my second coming. I told you that if people say that the Christ has appeared here or there, you should not go there. Why did I make that statement? Because as long as you think the Christ is appearing somewhere outside of you, you cannot accept that the Christ is appearing inside of you. What I'm saying here is that the second coming of Christ is indeed a real event, which I and my Father are looking forward to with great anticipation. However, the second coming of Christ is not an event whereby the Christ will appear in the form of the individual known as Jesus Christ. The second coming of Christ is an event whereby the universal Christ mind will appear in individualized form through those people who are willing to walk the path of personal Christhood. In other words, the second coming of Christ is an event whereby the Christ appears in you. This idea of the second coming in you is not blasphemy. It is very much part of God's plan. When I appeared as the sole representative of the universal Christ, the powers that be quickly killed me. I do not want to see that happen again. Therefore, I want thousands of people to put on the fullness of their personal Christhood. When that happens, the powers on this planet simply cannot kill all of them, and therefore are likely to kill none. I also want millions of people to put on a high degree of personal Christhood so that they can bring forth the living word that I am. When that happens, the powers that be simply cannot silence all of them. Therefore, I am asking you to understand that I do not want the first coming of Christ in me to become a roadblock that prevents the second coming of Christ in you. I am Jesus Christ, and at this moment, I am kneeling before your light stream at inner levels. I am pleading with you to please consider these ideas. Please accept that your personal Christhood is the best hope I have for bringing my Father's kingdom to this planet. Please accept that I desire to see you put on the fullness of your personal Christhood. Please accept that I also desire to see thousands of your brothers and sisters put on the fullness of their Christhood. Please surrender the entire idea that there is only one person who can become the Christ. In reality, there is no competition between Christed beings. My Father's grace is indeed sufficient for all. When God individualized himself as you, God gave you a portion of his being. However, a portion of infinity is still infinity. Therefore, you do not lose anything by recognizing the Christ in your brothers and sisters. God is all and God is in all. If you have one part of God's being, you have access to all of God's being. Simply accept that you are a part of the allness of God. Then accept that your spiritual brothers and sisters are also part of the allness of God. In fact, all that was ever made is part of the allness of God. You are a part of God's being. A part of God cannot be apart from God.